心あるがゆえに妬み、心あるがゆえに暗い、心あるがゆえに奪い、心あるがゆえに怒り、心あるがゆえに侮り、心あるがゆえに怒り、心あるがゆえにお前のすべてを欲する。
Before you begin to dissect the Espada individually, it's best to analyze what hollows and Arankars are, both in-universe and metaphorically. Bleach is steeped heavily in Buddhism and it recreates the cycle of samsara. Hollows are a really direct representation of the animal realm or general haunting ghosts. Hollows roll the two concepts into one. Most Buddhist ghost stories or ghost stories in general have the hauntings be the result of a soul having bad karma, dying in a tragic way or not being properly mourned. And hollows follow this trend. It's important to distinguish between hell and the animal realm because hell is where evil souls go and being reincarnated into an animal or becoming a ghost is just bad karma, which can be the result of too many sins, but not necessarily. Hollows are the results of holes not being exorcised quickly enough. They represent both a state of unfavorable reincarnation as well as a state of undead souls waiting for the next life. Human souls that were not blessed and exorcised end up as both deadly apparitions that haunt the living, as well as animals that have to spend a lifetime being hunted and hunting one another. Ajuchas in particular fear being eaten. They fear aggression and so are forced to hunt until they die or until a Soul Reaper exorcises them. It's a grim fate, and most Soul Reapers don't seem to hate hollows. They tend to be seen as annoying problems or pitied because their fate is so terrible. And the creation of a hollow is, in part, the failure of a Soul Reaper. Similar to Zanpakuto, the smaller a hollow is, the stronger it tends to be. A Menos will begin its life cycle as a Gillian, a hulking giant. Despite gaining more power as they feed and progress to a Vasto Lord, they shrink in size and in fact take on a humanoid appearance. All hollows were human souls at one point, and as they grow more powerful, they begin to reclaim their intelligence and humanity. Arankar sealing and controlling their hollow powers with Zanpakuto is just another step closer to that end. And that's essentially what most of the Espada's arcs are about. Human souls who lost their way struggling to reclaim or cope with the humanity they lost, as well as the shreds that they've gained back. And nearly all of them end in tragedy. The setting in which most of them do this is under Aizen's rule in Hueco Mundo. What was once a dog-eat-dog ecosystem for animals is now a young society, held together by a mutual fear of Aizen. In Soul Society, the different squads and characters would have skirmishes and disagreements with one another, but most of it wasn't directly confrontational or competitive, and when it was, it rarely resulted in death, because there's not much sense killing a comrade, especially when others will hold you accountable. But in Hueco Mundo, Arankars stab each other in the back, kill, and blatantly sabotage one another so readily, because they aren't used to the whole organization thing yet. And Aizen makes no real attempt to make them play nice because they are all disposable pawns at the end of the day. He even pits them against one another by ranking the Espada by number, encouraging their competitive nature. Tragically, in the Can't Fear Your Own World novel, some Arankars still want to believe Aizen will return and bring order again, but this is ultimately the animal realm. Lack of stability and security is the unfortunate fate of all hollows. This video will go through the 10 Espadas starting with number 9 and going downwards. But before we begin, let's talk about naming schemes. Anyone with a pair of ears and eyes can understand that the Espada have a Spanish naming scheme, and most of the Spanish words used are also spelled to have a meaning in Japanese. Espada is Spanish for swords, and Japanese for 10 blades. Resurrección is Spanish for resurrection, but in Japanese it means returning blade. Both meanings are appropriate because an animalistic hollow turned human will regain its animal traits, returning to a more primal state. I won't delve too deeply into the names of the Resurrections this time because, to be blunt, they aren't nearly as interesting as the names of the Soul Reapers Zanpakuto. It's really cool how all of them have a meaning in both Spanish and Japanese, but the meanings tend to be incredibly similar. For example, Stark's Los Lobos means the wolves in Spanish and pack of wolves in Japanese. Pantera, panther, panther king, etc, etc. If I had to guess why this is, it's because the author Tite Kubo probably has a much better grasp of Japanese than he does Spanish, so he can afford to be much more ambitious with his naming schemes when working with just one language. There will be two really cool exceptions that I find interesting, and I'll bring them up as we talk about individual Arankar. And I do think using Spanish as the language for the Arankar was a good decision in and of itself. The fact that all the largest factions in Bleach have their own language attributed to them makes them all feel distinct and highlights their differences. It also allowed the anime to create some of its best OST. And as a fun tidbit, the author of Kubo got many of the Arrancar's names from designers and models. Now with that said, let's begin. All hollows feed on other souls in an attempt to fill the void. They all feel empty and incomplete. The Arrancar and the Espada in particular all have unique obsessions that are a bit more complex than hunger. They all have different methods to fill their void. But the first Espada on the list is actually an exception to that rule, because he is the most primitive among them. He is the embodiment of gluttony and only seeks to eat endlessly. Character-wise, Eren was a little thin compared to the other Espada, mostly because they lack an identity of their own. They're still tailor-made to give Rukia a great fight, tormenting her by embodying her worst regret. To summarize, the fight is used to further illustrate Rukia's character arc regarding her willingness to die, beginning with her resigning to her execution and ending with her Bankai, which constantly threatens her very life, but she refuses to let it take her. This fight is the midpoint, where Rukia is willing to give Kaien her life out of guilt, only to change her mind because she can't afford to die until Orihime is safe, and then outright reject it once she remembers the meaning of the heart and what it means to die alone. I'll talk about this more in Ulquiorra's section, but typically whenever a character is talking about the heart, they either mean love and relationships or inner strength of will. Kaien might be dead, his literal heart along with his body might belong to Eren, but his true heart is with Rukia. His memory still feeds her strength long after he passed on. Eren as a character is mostly a means to that end, but lore-wise what exactly they are is pretty interesting. Representing gluttony, Eren is a mass of over 33,000 hollows and the only Gillian among the Espada. Gillians are a formation of hundreds of hollows and are the most animalistic stage in a Menos' life cycle. Eventually, one soul or personality among the hundreds will take over and begin to manifest its personality through its Ajucha stage, but Eren is still a Gillian, so it's fitting that it lacks a real identity. It refers to itself as they because it's not an individual. It's just a fake copying different souls that it ate. My favorite way this is shown is through their death. One head desperately screams out for Aizen to save them, and the other just quietly says, "Blast." If Eren had an obsession besides hunger, it would probably be a want for an identity, as is what all Gillians lack until they evolve. They may have taken pleasure in pretending to be Kaien and pretending to be a whole person with a whole life and backstory, but that's just a bit of speculation. They're clearly far more concerned with their hunger. And as one last bit of irony, Eren dies alone in the darkness and none of his comrades seem to care at all. Berrigan is the only one who really reacts, and even then, it's probably just because he's thinking tactfully, like when you lose a bishop in a game of chess. No one inherits their heart or memory. Eren appears to be some kind of sea creature, a cross between an octopus and a slug. Slug makes a lot of sense given its lowly bottom-feeding nature, and the fact that they hate sunlight could connect to a slug thriving on the ocean floor where no light reaches. Szayelapor's aspect of death is madness. He has an obsession with knowledge and he's willing to cross any line to get it. This is most interestingly explored in his fight with Mayuri, both of them trying to one-up each other in a game of freaky science ping-pong. I've already talked about this fight in my last Bleach video when talking about Mayuri, so I'll try to be brief. Szayelapor falsely believes he achieved perfection, only to be defeated by a Brug Mayuri first considered a failure. And then he receives a lecture about how nothing is perfect and perfection would be the death of science, because change and progress would cease to be. A common theme among the Espada is yearning to be the best. No matter what number Aizen tags them with, half the Espada still boast that they're the greatest, or that one day they will be. But the ones who actually have a spot at the top are just as unsatisfied and hungry as those who want their spot. Perfection is the word Szayelapor uses to express this aspect of being a hollow. Hollows will always yearn for more and more, so it's only natural that Szayelapor wants to be perfect. But he lost perspective on what scientists are in that pursuit. Every advantage he had over Renji and Uryer was due to his adaptability, studying them and preparing to fight them ahead of time. It's an admirable quality, but he didn't find the perfect solution to every opponent, so how could he be perfect? Szayelapor's animal seems to be a jellyfish. I was tempted to say a bird because he compared himself to a phoenix, but those tendrils that resemble wings also appear all over his lower body. His ability to reincarnate might be a reference to the immortal jellyfish, which can revert between life stages. In order to pad out this section, I'm gonna delve into some speculation about the Hell arc because I can't help myself. And also how hollows relate to Hell is kind of interesting. When hollows with evil souls are exorcised, they're sent to Hell. And based off what we know, Szayelapor may be the only truly evil Espada. A Zanpakuto can cleanse a hollow's sins, but only sins they committed as a hollow, meaning Szayelapor was an evil human, which sounds fair. All hollows are compelled to eat and fight by their nature. It'd be unfair to punish them all for indulging when being born as a hollow is a punishment in and of itself. Most of the Espada fought to sate their inherent emptiness, and because they believed Aizen would be their salvation from it. As cool as Xylopora was, I honestly feel bad for the guy, because he literally felt himself dying for centuries right before being damned to hell. I imagine that's enough suffering for any soul, but hell wants its share too. Zomari is the Espada who shows the most zeal in following Aizen. As an embodiment for control, he probably finds Aizen's rule comforting, because unlike Baragon, who made no real attempt to govern or unify the Hollows, Aizen did so with a goal and purpose for them in mind. Zomari even questions the Soul Reaper's right to rule. He questions their right to kill Hollows and their way of running things, which is exactly what Aizen is doing. He's questioning why the Soul Reapers are in power and why they blindly adhere to their traditions. And with his dying words, Zomari yells Aizen's name along with the war cry Banzai, which literally means 1,000 years, but its real meaning is more like long live the Emperor for 1,000 years. This love of control makes him a good foil to Byakuya, because in the previous arc, Byakuya diligently adhered to tradition and the letter of the law. He was the primary example of Soul Reapers being blindly loyal to the status quo that Aizen hated so much. But ever since he was defeated by Ichigo, he's been slowly growing out of that mindset. In fact, his motivation right now isn't to kill Zomari because Hollows must be killed. His motivation is to protect his sister, or as he would put it, his pride. One neat detail about this fight is that when Zomari lists examples of dominance, he says the sun controls the moon, and his Amora is shaped like a sun, while Byakuya has previously compared himself to the moon in the Soul Society arc. One stupid detail about myself is that I keep misremembering this guy as the Octava Espada, because he's an octopus, an octopi of 8 tentacles. But I'm actually wrong again, because Zomari is more likely a sea urchin. Because he's covered in spikes and after his resurrection, he stays in one place for the rest of the fight. Ironic considering he's supposedly the fastest Espada. Also, since he's supposed to reflect what Byakuya used to be, an agent of order, his lack of movement could be illustrative of stagnation. The next 3 sections are going to be the longest in the video because these 3 Espada are my favorites, and they're probably yours too. The king runs, shaking off his shadows, his armor clanking, scattering bones, tasting flesh and blood, crushing groaning hearts, stepping in alone to a distant beyond. I think Grimjaw and Ulquiorra are the most hollow hollows. If Ulquiorra is the perfect embodiment of emptiness and feeling incomplete, then Grimjaw is the embodiment of the thirst and desperation to fill that void. Grimjaw is defined by his pride. His motivation is simply to be the best and to prove it to everyone else. To that end, he always tries to get even with people, whether it's in the form of revenge or to repay a debt he owes. He always looks for a fair fight because he can't just win, he has to prove it to everyone, including himself, that he's the strongest. It's funny that in spite of this, he's labeled as number 6. A being far more powerful than him gave him more power and still calls him number 6. What could wound his pride more? All hollows are destined to be unsatisfied. They're destined to seek power, to hunt and be hunted, and starve until they die. But Grimjaw takes pleasure in that process. He embraces it, and how dare anyone take pity on him. He is a king and he will hunt forever and it will please him. He embraces the life of a hollow and therefore embodies destruction. Part of his need to prove himself comes from the sacrifice his friends made. If he can't make it to the top despite consuming them, then what was the point of making it this far? What was the point of all that time hunting? What was the point of them ever putting their faith in him? What's the point of this miserable hollow life if he can't become king? Grimjaw's second poem is not only a description of what all hollows have to live through if they want to survive, it's also probably the purest description we get of what went through his head as he ate his friends. Grimjaw's most important relationship is with Ichigo. Ichigo is a fellow warrior who takes pleasure in battle even if he himself doesn't realize it at first. As Ichigo becomes more aware of his competitive side, he seems ashamed of that fact. His motivations tend to be much kinder and nobler than people like Kenpachi or that mysterious white guy lurking in the back of his head who totally isn't just another part of his psyche. It doesn't help that this side of Ichigo scares Orihime as well. She's reminded of her brother's transformation into a hollow, but she quickly comes to accept it, and eventually Ichigo does as well. He takes satisfaction in beating people who look down on him, because who wouldn't? By admitting that, he better embraces his hollow side and then wins the fight against Grimjaw. Every arc in the story involves Ichigo going to a place, learning about the people there, and then integrating their stuff into his soul somehow. And Grimjaw is the one that would allow him to explore his hollow side. While Ichigo doesn't share the same pitiful fate, hollows are just an exaggeration of emotions everyone feels. One interesting detail about the Espada is that we actually don't know how many of them were Vasto Lords before Aizen found them. It's teased that he might have 20 at one point, but we actually don't know for sure. Based on what we do know, I think there are two possible cutoff points. Firstly, they were all Vasto Lords aside from Eren and possibly Yami, because they are the only ones implied or stated not to be. Eren was stated to be a mutated Gillian, and Yami may be a mutated Ajuchas, due to his sheer size compared to the others and because of his similarities to Ikomiki Domoe, a character from the Can't Fear Your Own World novel. The second possibility is that number 4 and Danwards are the only Vasto Lords because, as Ulquiorra says, those Espada have special restrictions that only apply to them. This can have an interesting effect on Grimjaw's backstory, because him and his comrades made it their life mission to be Vasto Lords, and eventually they give up that dream to give Grimjaw a better shot. So either Grimjaw managed to reach that state by eating parts of his friends, or he failed to reach that state despite their sacrifice, and then needed Aizen's help to progress. One of the reasons this was left ambiguous is probably because either way Grimjaw's animosity towards Aizen and the other Espada is justified through his pride, because regardless it will be wounded as long as there are others stronger than him. I think any large cat would have been a perfect fit for Grimjaw. Most of them are apex predators who typically live and hunt alone, a good symbol for a lonely king on top of the food chain. The first two things established about Noitora is that he loves to fight and he is incredibly touchy about being looked down on. Even his subordinate blocking an attack from an injured man is taken as an offense. At a glance, Noitora and Grimjaw are very similar in that they're both prideful, fight-horny maniacs. But Noitora immediately distinguishes himself by attacking Grimjaw's back. Grimjaw would never use a sneak attack on an off-guard opponent. How would he prove himself better otherwise? But Noitora doesn't have to prove anything to himself. Noitora is willing to sacrifice the satisfaction of a fair win for the satisfaction of any win, as long as he can lord it over everyone else. He explains battle as a result of inequality, and inequality is what he seeks. His iron skin is indicative of his desire to never lose. And his abrasive attitude towards everyone as well as his poem makes it clear that he wants to see everyone else as insects. The moon in particular is important to Noitora because of his consistent symbolism in the story. It's honestly one of my favorite examples of moon symbolism in Bleach. In Bleach, the moon represents a type of ideal, a nigh unobtainable goal or unbeatable opponent. And we see both in Noitora's poem and in a cover page of his desire to reach the moon. However, in his Resurrection, he takes on crescent moon symbolism, because even though he aspires to be unbeatable, he is forever flawed and incomplete. He will always be a petty little bug. Kenpachi is the perfect opponent for Noitora, because despite the surface similarities, Kenpachi doesn't have any of the petty hangups that plague Noitora. You could unironically compare these two to Goku and Vegeta when they first meet. One fights to win, the other fights for the sake of it. Noitora will take cheap shots whenever he can and cheat against opponents stronger than him, whereas Kenpachi constantly restricts himself so that he can try and enjoy himself against people weaker than him. When Noitora finds someone stronger than him, he immediately spites them. When Kenpachi finds someone stronger than him, he's happy as can be. He defeats Noitora by remembering that he can swing a sword with 2 hands, which is not only hilarious, but also interesting. Kenpachi's been fighting with handicaps for so long he forgot what all of them were, and Noitora dies learning that his opponent wasn't taking him very seriously from the beginning. Even with 6 arms, he couldn't defeat Kenpachi's 2. Noitora's pettiness even manifests in biases that have little to do with battle, mainly his hatred of strong women. He remarks that a guy being better than him is one thing, but a woman being better than him is absolutely disgusting. And to counter him again is Kenpachi, who doesn't discriminate against anyone, as long as they are strong. Most Soul Reapers looked down on Ichigo because he was a human, but not Kenpachi. And in fact, the warrior Kenpachi respects most is a woman. While it's unclear whether this hatred spawned from Nell or not, what did is his touchy attitude towards being defended, because Nell went out of her way to keep an eye on Noitora because he was weaker than her. All Arrancar feel emptiness and try and fill that void in different ways. Nell seems to fill her void with a desire to protect those weaker than her. That's probably one of the reasons she likes Ichigo and probably thinks of him as a kindred spirit, because he's protector number 1. It's tempting to call Nell the most sane and humane Arrancar. At the very least, she's the least bloodthirsty. She doesn't look down on Noitora just because she's a bit stronger than him. It's because she thinks he squanders his newfound humanity and chooses to be a beast. But no matter what, Arrancar can never fully escape their beastly nature, so Nell was destined to become an outcast. Her resurrection, which resembles a centaur, might also draw a parallel to the Greek mythos. See, most centaur are savage beasts, but occasionally one will be born far wiser and gentler than the rest, such as Chiron, who would teach and guide many Greek heroes. In spite of this, I think the story actually justifies Noitora's worldview more than it does Nell's. Nell thinks hollows and Arrancar can be better, and she's not entirely wrong. But even if they all chill out, all they have to inherit is an empty desert full of beasts and sand. And if they ever leave, Soul Reapers will attack them, and rightfully so, considering hollows are a danger to themselves and others. And the Minos are forced to feed on one another to maintain their sanity. It's easy to be a saint in paradise, but Wake Mundo is as far away from paradise as you can get. Notori's reckless, brutal behavior is the result of his despair. He understands that all hollows are doomed to violent deaths. Being given intelligence and working under Aizen won't change that fact. Firstly, because Aizen doesn't want to. The Arrancar are just tools to him. And secondly, it's questionable if Aizen could remove the hunger from an innately insatiable race. Faced with this, Notora just wants to make his own death as glorious as possible. I think that's why the story made him stronger than Grimjaw. Grimjaw is also a fight-horny maniac, and he's a lot more likable because he has a sense of honor, as crude as it is. But he didn't have the self-awareness that Noitora did. But only Noitora sees it for what it is. He wants to die before hitting the ground so that he doesn't have to suffer defeat and despair for too long. The name of Noitora's Resurrection is one of the few that I find interesting, Santa Teresa. It's impossible not to think of Saint Teresa. The praying mantis was given its name because it's usually keeping its hands together resembling prayer. It's kind of ironic that a sexist bug would scream out a holy woman's name to transform. This might imply that on some level, Notori wishes that Aizen, who aspired to be a god, or Nell, a virtuous woman, can save him from his life. But regardless, he has no real hopes in either of them. Him being a mantis is also doubly appropriate given their tendency to fight anything that moves, and how it's common for a male mantis to die at the hands of a female mate. Ulquiorra's first volume poem is one of my favorites because it's such a good introduction for his character. There is no meaning in the world. There is no meaning in those of us living there. We meaningless beings ponder the world, though the realization of meaninglessness itself means nothing. Ulquiorra is the most hollow hollows in the sense that he is completely empty. He's a nihilist. He believes life is devoid of meaning. He is an empty shell that goes along with Aizen's orders. I don't get the impression that it's out of fear or respect like most of the other Espada, but because he has simply resigned himself to drift along the easiest course with no will of his own. The way he talks is as if most people can't make meaningful decisions. That right belongs to only the most powerful people, like Aizen. Ulquiorra's poem insists that the realization of meaninglessness has no meaning, which makes sense. If you believe nothing matters, then self-awareness doesn't matter either. And yet despite that logic, Ulquiorra contradicts it. He goes out of his way to try and make other people despair like he does. He gets some satisfaction out of making people feel empty inside. So much so that he mockingly asks Orihime if he can find a heart by ripping it out of her chest. In Ulquiorra's mind, he's either expecting to find a crude, literal organ, or he will fail to find an intangible notion that means nothing, because it has no real form. He can't just attack Ichigo outright. He has to give Ichigo a reason to fight him and to get mad at him. He goes out of his way to display the gulf in power between him and Ichigo, showing him his second release form when his first one would have gotten the job done. He even gets mad when Ichigo refuses to give up, even though it shouldn't matter whether he gives up or not. The results won't change according to Ulquiorra, so why does he care? Early in the arc, Aizen only ordered him to watch Orihime and to give her food, so why does he insist on taunting her over Chad's supposed death? Wouldn't all his taunts against Ichigo and Orihime be meaningless, if the realization of meaninglessness was meaningless? He does it because he has to validate his nihilism by infecting others with it. This is further illustrated by his habit of killing opponents by poking holes in their chest, in the exact same spot where his hole is. If he feels the need to validate himself, then he is a hypocrite for indulging in pursuits that, according to his own logic, should be meaningless. His second release form exaggerates both the animal qualities and the hollowness of Ulquiorra's last form. His eyes are now pitch black like Ichigo's mask, and his hole is now much bigger. The markings on his body make it look like he's bleeding from it. The fact that he hid this power from the others is also interesting, because it means he may be the strongest Espada, and yet he hid his power, not trying to take titles like the Primera or King like the others. He was devoid of even the most common ambitions for a hollow. It's the small set of goals Ulquiorra does have that defines his subtle desires, the largest of which may be Orihime. Orihime is a kind girl in a den of monsters, and her kindness towards even those that would harm her makes her an enigma to the Arrancar, because they can't comprehend benevolence. It's this dedication and unwavering hope in her friends that intrigues Ulquiorra. Maybe his interest is piqued because he's tempted to break her down like he tries with Ichigo, or because he's envious of her faith. Maybe he simply lusts after her, but I'm willing to bet it's one of the former. If you're a Bleach fan, you've probably heard it 1,000 times because it's so cool. But Ulquiorra's death directly calls back to Rukia's flashback with Cayenne. When characters talk about the heart, they usually mean either love or inner strength of will. And Kyan says a heart doesn't exist inside a person, it exists between two people. A heart is born when a relationship is. And if someone was all alone, they wouldn't have a heart at all. So in a sense, Ulquiorra is right to think that people are empty inside. He just didn't realize that those intangible things exist in bonds and not individuals. Ulquiorra is physically powerful, but his mental fortitude isn't. He's actually pretty quick to lose hope once Ichigo's Vasto Lorde form proves stronger than him. Despite being alone in life, Ulquiorra dies in front of Ichigo and Orihime, and they're able to inherit his heart. He lives on in Orihime's memory and in Ichigo's new mask, which resembles Ulquiorra's face marks. Ichigo even gets angry on his behalf when Yami calls him trash. Ichigo's victory comes with a lot of dramatic irony because it feels hollow and unearned, but it also creates something of a paradox. Anger is the core motif of the Espada Yami, and Ichigo wins because he gave into that anger, becoming a beastly hollow in the process. The nuance here is that the human motivations, such as the 7 deadly sins, are what make us stray from the human path, but at the same time, trying to live devoid of these sins is impossible and just leaves you blind to your own faults and actions. I'm no expert in Buddhist philosophy or theology, but from what I can glean, the ultimate goal is to understand that every life is a different burden and to learn how to cope with them individually, along with the realization that you will live with them forever. In short, you need to understand the human soul in order to control it. Ulquiorra didn't understand it, and Ichigo's whole journey is about learning more and more about himself through the world and vice versa. His first opponent in his quest to save Orihime urges him to leave his sympathy behind and become a demon, and his last fight in that quest had him do just that. His hollow powers were tied to visceral emotions like anger, so it tied him to the animalistic hollows in Espada, and he came to understand them as a result. That's why he says it doesn't feel right when Yami calls Grimmjow and Ulquiorra trash, because he saw how they lived and how they died, and he inherited bits of their hearts. I like how this idea is teased when Ulquiorra talks about vizards. From his perspective, humans and Soul Reapers naturally need to imitate Arrancars to obtain strength. From Ulquiorra's nihilistic view, humans have to give up their humanity and by extension notions like the heart to be powerful, and because hollows are doomed to be empty, that path is as pointless as the rest. But Arrancars are just hollows imitating Soul Reapers. Vizards are made artificially, where hollows can become human-like Vasto Lords, and even Arrancars naturally. Some of the Espada, such as Stark, met Aizen without a hollow mask, implying he was an Arrancar long before they met. It's as I said in the beginning, hollows are animals, and tortured spirits reclaiming humanity. I'm not sure if bats have any particular significance with Ulquiorra's character. Most commonly, they're symbols of fear, and batwings specifically are attributed to various types of demons. So bats fit Ulquiorra's vibes to a T if nothing else. Following up the 3 longest sections of the video will now be the shortest. Sacrifice is the core tenet of Hallibel's character. Hollows live in a world of kill or be killed, so sacrifice is natural to them. But it's just as true for Soul Reapers and humans. For example, humans still eat animals to survive. But a more relevant example is how Yamamoto built and defended the Court Guard Squad by killing countless enemies. Hallibel's motif is integral to Bleach's world, which is why it's disappointing that she's the Espada I have the least to say about. Sharks commit cannibalism before birth, so that's a great pick for her animal. She has some neat parallels with Nell, both carry the number 3 and are far more chill than the rest of the Arrancar. Nell may have even been the embodiment of sacrifice before Hallibel was. But where Nell sacrifices herself to protect others, Hallibel capitalizes on the sacrifices of others. Her goons sacrifice their limbs to summon Ion, and she swears to get revenge after their defeat. And she seems like the Espada who cares the most for her underlings, which makes her a suitable pick for the ruler of Hueco Mundo. But she's also a boring pick because of how underdeveloped she is. The most interesting part about her is probably the fact that Aizen defeats her. She didn't even get to go down fighting the enemy. Aizen cuts her down himself just for the heck of it. She wasn't even a sacrifice. Unfortunately, we don't get to learn much about Hallibel, nor can I find many lines to read in between. If anyone out there has more to say about Hallibel, my comment section would love to hear it, along with anything else you think I missed on the other Espada. Baragan's aspect of death is senescence. Aging is the most inevitable form of death. It's a force so universal that it could very well be the power of a god. So it's a wonder how he's only ranked number 2 among the Espada. While most can just assume Stark and Yami have an overwhelming advantage in spiritual pressure, there's a more satisfying reason. No one can be number 1 forever. Time will make us all grow older and weaker until it takes us. Baragan was a king, but even he is not immune to time. He too fears his own power because he is not immune to it. As King of the Hollows, he is constantly surrounded by death, but his own is inevitable. He tries to reject that possibility by calling himself a god, but he too will decline and inevitably be replaced by another king. He had the power of impermanence and was arrogant enough to believe he was an exception to it. There are now younger, more powerful Espada and a new king of Hueco Mundo, And after this arc, Haliba will take over as king, and life in Wakamundo will be largely unchanged. What makes this even sadder is that being king of Wakamundo isn't as glamorous as Baragan boasts it as. As king, he ruled nothing but beasts and sand. His castle had no ceiling or structure, but he still denies it by calling the sky his ceiling. He is recognized as the most powerful hollow by all and is still bored and unsatisfied. He has an army with no enemies. He is a king of nothing and his crown is too heavy to enjoy. Baragan made himself king for its own sake, and so his reign was directionless. While Aizen gave the Espada a goal to work towards, he gave Las Noches a ceiling and a sun. He added real structure and hope to Wakamundo, while Baragan made no real attempt to do anything with Wakamundo once he had it. If there were any two Espada I wish interacted more, it would be Baragan and Grimmjow. Because Baragan is the king Grimmjow sought to be, but even without interactions between the two, we can see what would happen if Grimmjow got his wish. He would still be empty and unfulfilled. He would lose all challenge, all excitement, and be bored to death until someone comes to take his crown away. It looks like chasing the crown might be better than actually having it. The interactions between Baragan and Aizen are few in number, but I love them all. The flashback is great because it's Aizen destroying Baragan's delusions of being a god, which perfectly fits with Aizen's deal, which is to question all things and to question all gods. Baragan taking charge after Aizen is sealed by Yamamoto's flames shows how with Aizen gone he has the confidence to be king again. And lastly, Baragan throwing his axe at Aizen in a final act of defiance is such a perfect end for his character. Hollows are associated with animals, but Baragan is the sole exception among the Espada. He is a human skeleton. The king of the Hollows is both the most human, while also being a straightforward representation of death. He's even compared to a Shinigami. It's clear that the final stages of a Hollow are made to resemble human forms. Vassal Lords and Arrancar both. Baragan in particular due to wearing a black cloak and wielding a bladed weapon, just like a Soul Reaper. The name of his resurrection is Arrogante, Spanish for arrogant and Japanese for Grand Emperor of Skulls. The latter is an accurate description of his appearance, and the former suits both his own personal arrogance, as well as his habit of accusing everyone else of being arrogant. They say it's lonely at the top, and Stark proves it as well as Baragan does. Stark and Lil Net were originally a single Vasto Lorde, one so strong that other Hollows would die by getting too close. Unable to bear that solitude, it split into two to supplement its own loneliness. Stark followed Aizen because Aizen was stronger than him and therefore capable of being his friend. He seemed genuinely grateful to Aizen, allowing him to have comrades, unlike most of the Espada. But despite his loneliness, Stark doesn't interact with the other Arrancar very much, which feels a bit strange. If he wanted companions so badly, why does he feel nothing when his comrades are killed? He could just be trying to play it cool, but it doesn't seem all that effective in the long run. It could be that his loneliness is stated by Lilnet and by merely getting to live amongst his own kind. He does think of the other Espada as he dies, saying he's not alone anymore, so maybe that was enough. He has developed a heart for all of his comrades, but they don't appear to be very strong. The way Stark interacts with his powers are, intentionally or not, actually the closest any Hollow comes to a real Zanpakuto. He talks with a part of himself in the form of Lilnet, and that other half becomes his weapon. He even follows a trend that's consistent with Soul Reapers. Those that dual-wield Zanpakuto have multiple aspects to their soul or more than one. Shunsui is carrying Nanao Zanpakuto, Ukitake is a host for Mimihagi, and Ichigo is everything. While Stark has split his soul into two pieces. Wolves, coyotes, and other canines are pack animals. Stark's ability to summon a pack of wolves is symbolic of his desire to belong to a group. Though his allies are just smaller pieces of his own soul made to explode, the sight alone gives him some comfort. Stark wanted a friend more than anything, so him being defeated by Shunsui in a children's game is fitting. This is just a personal theory of mine, but I'd like to imagine that the original Hollow that made up Stark and Lilnet resembled Lilnet more. Stark says he wished to be weak, and clearly his former self felt the same way if it split its power into two. So maybe that original personality made its half the weaker one to enjoy the protection and company of others to the fullest. She would no longer have to bear that power anymore. Or maybe there's simply two of the many souls that made up the original Menos. Baragan and Stark show us the two possible futures for Hollows who make it to the top. A king unfulfilled by the wasteland he rules, and a lone wolf too powerful to be close to others. There's also a third route that we'll discuss in our next section, but regardless, no matter how powerful a Hollow becomes, they won't ever fill the voids they carry. Yami's inconsistent strength is pretty consistent with how inconsistent anger is. It has the potential to be one of the strongest emotions, but it isn't as pervasive as others like loneliness or senescence. Yami fluctuates in strength because he has to build up power over time, storing up stamina, anger, stress, and even the energy other people hit him with. Anger is the emotion that unleashed Ichiro's Vasto Lorde form, so the story has already shown how terrifying an angry Hollow can be. In fact, Yami's volume poem appears right before Ichiro's Vasto Lorde transformation, and it's easy to see how it can apply to Ichigo. His rage has blinded him to the point that he forgot what he was fighting for to begin with, only taking flesh, blood, and bone, but forgetting about his friends and their shared heart. Ukiyo's death is what causes Yami to transform. Far as we can tell, Ukiyo was the one person Yami liked, although he isn't too torn up about concerning he's calling Ukiyo trash a few minutes later. But that could just be because he's riled up and angry. Yami dying as he lies next to his pet dog, Kukapuro, was a good decision. Not only does it invoke a little sympathy, but it also seems like Yami can't summon any more anger because he can't get generally mad at the dumb dog. Yami appears to be a chimera of different animals, a weird mix between a gorilla, centipede, and a dinosaur. At least two of those come to mind when thinking of rage. It's a weirdly funny twist that Yami was the secret Zeroth Espada. So weird I don't blame anyone for calling it cheap. But I like it because now I laugh whenever I read either of these lines. But still, the disappointment is easy to understand. Possibly the strongest Espada is twist revealed late into the arc, and just as suddenly he's defeated off screen. If I had to force an analysis of his fight against Byakuya and Kenpachi, I'd have a little to say because it was off screened. It's funny and kind of interesting that his two opponents typically never show or experience anger when they fight. Kenpachi fights joyously and Byakuya is always calm and collected, but pair them together and they start pissing each other off. This could have been an interesting fight, or at the very least the best comedy fight in Bleach. But it is what it is now. Overall, Yami is an underwhelming character. However, from a theory and lore perspective, he can point to more interesting things. Things that are more directly explored in the Can't Fear Your Own World novel. Iko Miki Domoe is a hollow with abilities similar to Eren and an appearance similar to Yami. It didn't evolve like Vasto Lorde, who took humanoid forms. Instead, it simply became a larger, richer version of an Ajuchas, with the density of reishi that can match a Vasto Lorde, upscaled, rejecting a return to humanity for a more beastly form. It seems like Eren and Yami were evolving to resemble Iko Miki Domoe, which might explain why their resurrections make them giant and both of their main strengths was a huge pool of reishi. Eren may have had a small pool compared to the other Espada, but it was still one of his greatest strengths, and Yami can instantly summon more energy to match his rage. This divergence in evolution shows that hollows can become stronger by either rejecting their humanity to live as greater beasts, or to reclaim what humanity they can get. Thank you all for watching. Bleach is one of my favorite manga, and the Arrancar arc is my favorite portion of the story. The Espada are a great collection of villains, because they are characters who are destined to be incomplete and hungry no matter which path they take. They are tragic monsters that reflect and exaggerate human struggles, while also looking cool as all heck while they do it. A couple of them could have been developed better, but overall they're really solid, and the highs are some of the best villains in the entire medium. I think the most underrated is Noitora. Despite having all the characteristics of a typical shonen mini-boss, the reasons why he acts that way, and how it's contrasted with the rest of the cast, along with really well made symbolism, elevates him in a way I wish I saw more often in another manga. As with most things in Bleach, many things are intentionally subtle or left to interpretation. So if your thoughts differ from mine, or if you thought I missed anything interesting, please leave a comment. The ones I got under my last Bleach video were really fun to read, and in fact I'm considering discussing some of them with a friend on my side channel, where I also have other Bleach content if you're interested. But be warned, the first one is about the worst criticism in Bleach, the second is unapologetic Bleach wank, the third is a bunch of garbage, and the fourth is a debate about which characters are tops and which are bottoms, which somehow got more views than an hour-long video essay I spent months on. As for the main channel here, I'm seriously considering doing a Ginjo video, and possibly a fourth one about the Blood War, or maybe about the Quincy's, or maybe about Yurabok specifically. I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm definitely not done with Bleach here. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.